Hello and welcome to the first lecture in the first module of our Internet Law and Governance Foundations class. This is Professor David Opterbeck. In this module, we will introduce the concepts of cybersecurity and cyberspace, discuss some basics of Internet history and governance, and outline some fundamental threats to cybersecurity. The term cybersecurity invokes the image of cyberspace. The legal, policy, and compliance issues that relate to cybersecurity and privacy therefore concern the governance of cyberspace. But what is cyberspace and how can it be governed? The term cyberspace was coined by novelist William Gibson and began to infiltrate the public imagination through Gibson's novel Neuromancer, which was published in 1984. It draws on the term cybernetics, which refers to the study of regulatory systems, including human-machine interfaces, artificial intelligence, and self-regulating networks. Gibson imagined a virtual world in which people plugged their conscious minds directly into a vast computer network that allowed users to construct alternate identities and realities. While this virtual cybernetic world, this cyberspace, created new possibilities for human community, it also facilitated a dark underworld of virtual crime. When Gibson published Neuromancer in 1984, the Internet as we know it today did not exist. It's almost impossible to imagine that just a few decades ago there was no Google, no YouTube, no Wi-Fi, no Facebook, no Twitter, no Tumblr, no cloud, not even generally available email, instant messaging, or cell phones. You really have to step back for a moment and let this sink in. Outside of a very few elite university researchers and government employees, just a few decades ago, nobody used email. There was no World Wide Web, and the concept of a smartphone or laptop computer in every home was science fiction. The fact that you are taking part of this class online reflects one of the most far-reaching, dynamic, technological, and social revolutions in all of human history. Many today argue that this revolution was made possible in significant part by freedom from central governance structures. No one planned or legislated how the Internet should develop. No governmental authority dictated or restricted what standards and protocols could be used to interconnect the diverse pieces of hardware that comprise the Internet's physical backbone. The technical gurus who established the basis for the Internet as we know it were left alone to craft efficient engineering solutions to the problems they faced. If legal systems and governmental policy planners became involved in the process, the results almost always were detrimental to the goal of a seamless and open network. That at least is one version of the story. A more nuanced study of what we now call Internet governance demonstrates that the Internet's development has been both supported and hindered at various points by a mix of national and international laws, conflicting public policies, and quasi-governmental internal oversight. It's helpful to think of Internet governance in terms of the layers of a communication network. These include the following, starting from the bottom or most basic layer and moving up toward the most complex: the hardware layer, the protocol or code layer, and the content layer. The hardware layer includes the cables, routers, storage devices, and other physical components of the network. It represents an enormous aspect of global infrastructure. For example, there are about 550,000 miles of subsea cable that carry Internet traffic across continents. The protocol or code layer includes the communications protocols and software that allow all of the components of the Internet to work together. Hypertext Markup Language, or HTML, for example, is a system of computer code that allows all sorts of different kinds of documents and files to be linked together across devices, networks, and platforms. The content layer includes the semantic aspects of the Internet. Semantics involves the distinction between sign and what is signified, that is, between the form of a communication and its meaning. As you listen to this lecture, you are hearing the sounds of a language that you have learned to interpret into meaningful concepts. You can think of the concepts that are being communicated to you at this moment as part of the Internet's content layer. Each of these layers relates to different legal and policy structures. The hardware layer involves a vast array of national and local laws concerning private property, utilities regulation, zoning and land use, telecommunications, and so on. The content layer involves sometimes sharply different concepts about freedom of speech, public decency, educational policy, and censorship. The protocol or code layer presents a particularly interesting case. At least some of the computer code that makes the Internet run could possibly be subject to copyright or other forms of intellectual property protection. The community of researchers and engineers who pioneered the Internet, however, decided early on to create open platforms that were free of intellectual property restrictions, so that anyone could use and improve upon them. It was clear from the beginning, however, that other aspects of the protocol or code layer, particularly the system of domain name addresses, required some sort of ownership and oversight structure. If anyone could use any address, the system would quickly become chaotic and unstable. The system for assigning domain names initially was managed by a single person, but was later assumed by a private not-for-profit corporation, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN, under a contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. The link with the U.S. Department of Defense highlights another aspect of Internet history. Parts of the Internet backbone were first developed by the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to support military communications in the event of a nuclear war. ICANN has gradually become more independent and currently operates under a multi-stakeholder model. It is important to understand that this critical aspect of Internet governance remains voluntary and not under the direct control of any nation-state or international treaty body such as the United Nations. The Internet's open architecture, loose, mostly voluntary governance structure, and open-source ethos contributed significantly to the network's extraordinary scalability. That is, to the way in which the Internet became, in a very short time, a truly ubiquitous global platform. This has created great cultural, political, and economic benefits. It has also created, however, enormous opportunity for exploitation. The very thing that makes the network uniquely valuable also makes it uniquely vulnerable. In our networked world, every individual, every business, every organization, and every government is vulnerable to cyber attack. As the Obama administration stated in its 2009 Cyberspace Policy Review, cyber threat is one of the most serious economic and national security challenges we face as a nation. Recent estimates suggest that cybercrime results in more than $1 trillion in losses annually worldwide. Common attack vectors include malicious code intrusions, social engineering, physical devices, and insider attacks. Of these, malicious code intrusions and social engineering attacks remain the most pervasive and damaging in terms of total economic losses. These sorts of attacks are often associated with organized crime activity. Physical attacks, however, are becoming more prevalent as the technology for such attacks improves and disseminates, and they also are employed by organized crime groups. Insider attacks also are common. Malicious code intrusions involve the use of malicious computer code and/or programs, malware, to gain access to a computer and/or network. A virus is a kind of malware that replicates itself through the spread of an infected host file. When the infected file is transferred to a new computer through email, an internet download, or otherwise, the virus tags along. A worm is a kind of malware that self-replicates without the spread of a host file. It worms its way through the computer networks as it reproduces itself. A Trojan horse is a file that appears to be legitimate, but in fact introduces malicious code. Trojan horses require the user to execute the false program and are not self-replicating. A SQL injection is the use of a string of malicious code in a web application to gain access to a back-end database. Each of these kinds of attacks exploits vulnerabilities in the architectures of computer operating systems such as Windows and networks such as the Internet. The metaphors of virus, worm, and injection therefore are quite apt. We cannot live without our bodies, and our bodies must learn to combat all sorts of infection agents that have evolved to exploit our physiology. Similarly, we can no longer live without data networks, and we must manage the infection agents that can exploit them. Social engineering attacks involve the use of counterfeit sources to lure victims into disclosing confidential information. Phishing is a form of social engineering attack in which the victim receives an authentic-looking but fake email purporting to come from an institution such as a bank with which the victim has an account or other connection. The email might request that the victim update his or her login and password information. Spoofing is a form of phishing in which the victim is directed to an authentic-looking but fake website and induced to enter personal information. Physical attacks employ physical devices to obtain personal information. For example, a credit card skimmer can read the data on a credit or debit card's magnetic strip. Skimmers can comprise handheld units used by clerical employees when a customer's card is taken to a backroom register at the point of sale. Skimmers can also be inserted into self-service units such as gas pumps. Some cybercriminals have also used counterfeit debit card PIN entry overlays to record customer PIN entries. Finally, insider attacks are undertaken by trusted agents of an organization. Insiders might use authentic credentials to access information for use in an unauthorized manner, such as disclosure to a competitor. Insiders also might gain access to resources that require a higher level of authorization than the agent legitimately possesses. The reasons for cyber attacks include direct and secondary financial gain, hacktivism, terrorism, and espionage or war. A traditional reason for cyber attack is direct financial gain. This remains a primary motivation for many cyber attacks. Cybercriminals frequently seek the personally identifying information of website users and business customers so that they can employ those credentials in illicit transactions. For example, in 2008, federal law enforcement cracked a cyber crime ring that penetrated the back-end databases used to process credit card transactions for small businesses such as pizza restaurants. The credit card information was used to create counterfeit cards which were used by runners to purchase expensive luxury items at high-end retailers. The items were fenced through online auction sites such as eBay, using anonymous online payment mechanisms such as PayPal. Cyber attacks can also produce secondary financial gain for the attacker. A malicious code intrusion can be used to insert a persistent tool called a rootkit on the infected computer. The rootkit gives the hacker control over the infected computer's resources without the victim's knowledge. Large numbers of these infected robot computers are networked together into botnets. The aggregate power of a botnet can be used for purposes such as sending bulk spam email, hosting pornography, and implementing distributed denial-of-service attacks. Some organized criminal groups have amassed botnets of millions of compromised computers, which are available for lease to spammers and others. There is also a robust market in software tools, including viruses, worms, and rootkits, which have become increasingly user-friendly and commodified. As FBI Assistant Director of the Cyber Division Gordon Snow testified recently before the Senate Judiciary Committee, these criminal groups have programmers who write the malicious software, salespeople who sell the code or lease out botnet services, and, in some instances, dedicated support personnel. Hacktivism is the use of cyber attacks to make a social or political statement. Groups such as Anonymous have shut down networks and defaced websites of corporate and political organizations. Their activities are difficult to track and prevent because such groups tend to operate under a distributed, non-hierarchical model, much like terror cells. Cybersecurity experts expect such activity to become more prevalent with the rise of the black market in user-friendly cyber attack tools and commercial botnets. Cyber attacks also have become viable tools for terrorism, national security, and war. The Stuxnet virus, for example, was a highly sophisticated effort to interfere with Iran's nuclear capabilities. Stuxnet was developed and deployed as part of a cyber initiative started in the Bush administration and continued by the Obama administration called Olympic Games. The recently discovered Dooku and flame worms, which are designed for espionage, also seem to have been developed by governments. It is increasingly evident that national and industrial infrastructure, supply chains, and communication networks are vulnerable to cyber terror attacks. Moreover, as with most terrorism-related activity, in cyberspace there are potentially major synergies between organized crime and terrorism or espionage. Some sources suggest, for example, that China's Cyber Blue Team or other Chinese agents have probed U.S. corporate networks in order to obtain industrial and military secrets. Indeed, in 2009, more than a terabyte of information concerning the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter was exfiltrated from the Pentagon in a cyber theft that might have originated in China. The varied nature and modes of cyber threats demonstrate why cybersecurity is a fundamental challenge to Internet governance, and indeed to the Internet itself. Every democratic society faces constant tensions between liberty and security. Liberty is not possible without security, because crime, violence, and disorder destroy the basis for human freedom and flourishing. But security inevitably encroaches on liberty, because security measures entail some degree of surveillance and limits on activities that might not in themselves constitute threats to liberty. If these tensions are enormously difficult in democratic societies with robust constitutional legal systems, they are even more difficult in cyberspace, which is a unique space only because the code and content layers of the network developed without top-down governance. Cybersecurity compliance therefore represents a basic aspect of the Internet society.